Wow, I am honored and awed by being on this panel, and thank you all for coming today. It's amazing to see everybody here tonight. Tom did an amazing job talking about the impact that NAFTA and the WTO have had on Oregon workers, and those effects are obvious for many, many people in this room. What I'm going to talk about tonight is the environmental effects of these trade agreements that may be slightly less obvious for some of us in this room. I'm going to talk about these environmental impacts, particularly how they affect global warming, and it's going to get a little daunting, I think. But I'm going to try to end on a hopeful note and how we can turn these trade agreements into a force for good for the environment as well as for workers and human rights. Free trade agreements are worsening our environment and worsening the problem of climate change in a number of ways, and some of which are probably pretty obvious. First and foremost, when companies offshore, they move to countries with fewer environmental controls, and they can put massive amounts of air pollutants, water pollutants into our environment. For example, China's energy portfolio is 40% more carbon intensive than the state of Oregon. So that means when a paper mill, for instance, moves to China and they flip on the switch, they just turn on machinery. They're spewing 40% more carbon into this atmosphere than they would if they were in the state of Oregon. In addition, because of the fewer pollution controls, they're putting in more heavy metals into the air, which have massive effects on the local people. So that means that when we get our nice, shiny things from China, they get massive public health problems. Second, the transportation sector is a huge component of the global warming problem. It accounts for about 25% of carbon dioxide emissions globally. And we've created this economic system that depends on shipping goods internationally. It has massive pollution control problems. In addition, it's completely absurd, and I like to point this out because it's just ridiculous what we've created. We have ships leaving the U.S. full of timber or wheat or whatever we produce here in the U.S. At the same time, we're bringing the same products in. In addition, I like to tell this little snippet because I find it completely ridiculous. Fish that's caught off the coast of Norway is actually sent to Southeast Asia for processing and then sent back to Norway for consumption. And only in a world where we externalize environmental impacts does that even begin to make sense. The climate change crisis is a moment where we can all look at our economic system and realize that the environmental resources that we take for granted, like our air and our water, those things that we kind of need, they're not free and they are not easy to replace. In addition, the third impact I want to talk about is how free trade agreements open up some of the most pristine and biodiverse places in this earth. Companies can go in after free trade agreements and suck out all of the resources, the timber, the oil, the minerals, and we leave local economies devastated. In addition, deforestation is the cause of 20% of the carbon dioxide emissions globally, and I heard a startling fact this weekend that the remaining trees in the world could actually become a carbon producer rather than a carbon sink because of the massive amounts of deforestation and the forest fires that are actually releasing all of the carbon that were formerly held in the trees. And finally, free trade agreements undermine our democracy in a variety of ways. They set ceilings rather than floors for basic standards for food safety and product safety. And in addition, many of the proposed policies, the creative policies that we're coming up to address climate change, are actually violations of current trade agreements. So yeah, free trade agreements are a huge, huge problem. And we need a new model, and we need it fast. One thing we've learned from trade agreements, though, is that international agreements can work if they are enforceable. And I think looking at trade agreements and the enforcement mechanisms in trade agreements versus international environmental agreements really, really brings out the priorities that our global society has held. Trade agreements, if you violate them, they come with massive amounts of penalties, tens of millions of dollars, if not billions for a country, as well as trade sanctions, if that's applicable. International environmental agreements, as well as labor rights agreements and human rights agreements, rely upon the good goodwill of the countries that are parties to these agreements. They are someday intentions, and yet the differences in this represent what we have held to be important in our society. And I think everyone in this room probably agrees that we have it completely backwards. So we need to change that, and we need to change it today. I know we all hear the gloom and doom of global warming on a daily basis, and I think that Tom made a really, really compelling speech, and I think when we hear about job loss, we have a visceral and emotional connection to that. But global warming is real, and it's going to affect the generations that are here today. In a recent article, the head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change stated, if we allow things to continue unchanged and we don't take action today, it will destabilize human society. When he's talking about that, he's not talking about 200 years from now. He's talking about 4 people that are alive right now. So, again, we need to change a lot of things, and trade can be a component of the solution for global warming. First and foremost, we need to renegotiate our trade deals. We need to make sure that the environment, that labor, that humans in general come first before corporate expansion. Second, we need our leaders to start using trade agreements creatively. Trade agreements could be used to internalize the environmental impacts of imported goods by putting on, for instance, carbon border taxes proposed within various climate change schemes. We will be better off both environmentally and both for workers. We can recreate a new green economy and live in harmony with this world and keep just better off. So finally, we as a country, as a global society, no longer have the luxury of making bad choices. We need to survive living wage jobs in a stable environment, and we can do it. So thank you all for being here and taking the first step.